she who must be obeyed. How one man now rules China. Now, The Economist China editor believes that Beijing just won't budge. James Miles joins me now to discuss where this protest could be heading. Welcome.
Thank you.
So you heard the last thing Dr. Kim said, that he doesn't think there will be an intervention because Beijing just couldn't afford that. Do you agree? Is that The Economist's view?
Well, I think China would try its hardest and be persuading the Hong Kong government as strenuously as it can to avoid that particular scenario. It knows that the risks here are enormous. This is the most complicated outbreak of street unrest that China has faced since Tiananmen Square. It, of course, has faced a number of other outbreaks of street protests here and there around China, but this one has peculiar characteristics for China. It's in an internationally important area of the country. The world's eyes are watching Hong Kong. If a mistake is made in the handling of these protests, then China, as Dr. Chan just said, will suffer some consequences in terms of the handling of Taiwan and indeed the arrangements for Hong Kong in the future.
He mentioned Taiwan and others have. Presumably China has a lot at stake here, though, its own red lines in terms of domestic political upheaval and what somebody like Taiwan or elsewhere might take from this.
Well, there's a clear red line here, and that's very important to recognize, because protesters have come out on the streets of Hong Kong before. They did in 2003. That was triggered by opposition to plans to introduce an anti-subversion law in the territory. In the end, those protests caused that law to be shelved. Then a couple of years ago, students were out protesting, this time against plans to introduce what was called patriotic education in schools. Again, plans were shelved, but now we're at this red line. There is no way that China will accept the notion of a fully developed Western-style democracy in Hong Kong.
Can it make it such a way that it wouldn't be a Western-style democracy? I mean, could it call it something else to save face? Because clearly, I don't know what you make of Dr. Chan saying that we believe that we have the leverage to get our chief executive, CY Leung, to step down.
Well, I wouldn't rule out the possibility that CY Leung might have to step down eventually. He wasn't the first choice of Beijing for this particular job. But at this stage, given that the demonstrations this time are illegal, unlike those two other big outbreaks that I mentioned.
He even admitted it. It's an illegal direct action.
Exactly. China, I think, would suffer, as it feels it, a considerable loss of face if it were to back down in the face of these demonstrations. Therefore, I think it's highly unlikely that they would push Mr. Leung out. And even if they do, they certainly wouldn't then revise the electoral plans that they have in place.
So do you think there's a lot of wishful thinking on behalf of these students? I guess the real question is, how important is the outpouring? Are they people who China can just dismiss? Is it just students? Are there more people in? Who really matters in terms of tipping the balance in Hong Kong?
Well, that's very interesting, because what's clear about these demonstrations is that students are at the heart of them. We've all been talking about Occupy Central. There's this group of people led by academics at key universities in Hong Kong. But in the end, what brought these protesters out was students. University students, as well as secondary school students, have been boycotting classes for the last few days. And students have a very special place in Hong Kong culture and indeed in Chinese culture generally. They are held in considerable respect, and it was partly because of that the authorities in Beijing in 1989 during Tiananmen Square hesitated in their handling of this, and I think we could be facing a similar sort of situation again.
And meantime, back to your cover here, talking about Xi Jinping, the leader in China. Yeah, people thought there would be some reform there, but I mean, this is a one-man game there. Well,
he's accumulated power more rapidly than we've seen any other leader accumulate power since Deng Xiaoping, possibly since Mao Zedong, who died in 1976. Wow. So he's an extraordinarily powerful man, and he has a lot at stake in this particular situation. He was in charge of the Hong Kong portfolio before he actually became Communist Party leader at the end of 2012. If mistakes are made in Hong Kong, he stands to be blamed for it. So I think that's another reason why we're unlikely to see him back down.
And how bad would it be for today's super powerful Chinese leader to say, well, okay, I mean, in some form or another, why don't you just go ahead and have a real election? How bad could it be for China?
Well, the risk as he sees it is that this could spread. He's taken over at a time when China's middle class has grown to huge proportions. This is a new force in Chinese society. It's looking ahead over the next few years to slowing economic growth, to less of the benefits of this frothy double-digit growth that China's experienced over the last 10 years. And he worries about their demands for greater control over their own daily lives, the same kind of demands that people in Hong Kong have. And the risk that this could spread over the border, I think, is really preying on his mind right now.
James Miles, thank you very much for coming in and helping us understand. And while thousands of protesters have we seen, flooded the streets of Hong Kong, you might think the incendiary images of the protests, like these taken by our own Ivan Watson and his team, would filter back to the mainland via social media. But think again. In the last few days, Instagram, which is the popular photo-sharing app, has suffered outages inside China, which means no images of the pro-democracy movement across the water. With Facebook and Twitter already blocked, many Chinese had depended on Instagram as a window onto the world beyond. Now, after a break, we'll turn to another flood, this one